Picture this, a war so massive it stretched from the frozen tundra of Alaska to the steaming jungles of the Pacific. Millions of American soldiers shipped off to places they couldn't even point to on a map before the war. Now here's the real kicker. When they got there, there weren't any barracks, no houses, not even a roof over their heads, just mud, rain, and the elements beating down. So how did the U.S. military solve this? They didn't ship lumber halfway across the world. They didn't waste time building fancy bases. They invented one of the strangest, yet most effective solutions you've probably never thought about: the Quonset Hut. A curved, corrugated steel half-cylinder that could pop up anywhere, anytime, and keep soldiers alive. And let me hit you with a number that's going to stick in your brain. More than 100,000 of these huts were built during World War II. That's not a typo. That's an industrial flood of steel and sweat, turned into homes, hospitals, command centers, and even chapels. Imagine landing on a remote island in the Pacific in 1943 and watching one of these structures rise out of the dirt in a single day, ready to house dozens of men. It almost sounds like science fiction, but it was real. Here's the shocker. These huts weren't just military quick fixes. They were a quiet revolution in logistics and housing. Think about it. World War II wasn't just fought with bullets and tanks. It was fought with supply lines, infrastructure, and the ability to keep men fed, sheltered, and ready. The Germans had their fortresses. The Japanese had their caves. But the Americans? They had a portable, packable, indestructible hut that could be shipped flat, assembled with a handful of guys, and survive a typhoon. That's the kind of edge that doesn't make it into Hollywood war movies, but it made a difference. And if you're thinking, okay, but a hut is just a hut, here's why you'll want to stick around. These things didn't disappear when the war ended. After 1945, they became part of American life. College dorms, churches, diners, even housing for returning GIs under the GI Bill. Some of them are still standing today, rusting but stubborn, reminders of a time when the U.S. was cranking out war gear at a pace the world had never seen before. So in this video, we're going to dive into how the Quonset Hut was born, how it spread across the globe like wildfire, what it was really like to live inside one, and how something designed to be temporary turned into a permanent stamp on history. It's a story about steel, sweat, and sheer American ingenuity. And trust me, you'll never look at a half-cylinder the same way again. By late 1941, America was staring down a logistical nightmare. The attack on Pearl Harbor forced the U.S. into a global war that would demand troops in every corner of the planet. Millions of men were about to ship out, and every single one of them needed food, water, and a roof over their heads. But the problem was clear. How do you house an army that's constantly on the move? Traditional wooden barracks took too long to build, and shipping heavy construction materials halfway across the world was out of the question. The military needed something new, something fast, cheap, portable, and tough enough to handle everything from blizzards to monsoons. This urgency wasn't just about comfort. Soldiers fighting in North Africa, on remote Pacific islands, or in frigid Alaskan outposts couldn't afford to be weakened by exposure. A sick or exhausted soldier wasn't just one man down. It was a break in the chain of war. American planners knew they had to solve the shelter problem before it snowballed into lost battles. The question wasn't if they'd come up with a solution, it was how fast they could do it. And here's where the Navy stepped in. In early 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy realized it would need portable housing for its expanding bases. They didn't want bulky tents that ripped in the wind. They didn't want wooden shacks that rotted in the jungle. They wanted a building you could box up, ship anywhere, and bolt together with minimal tools. The kind of structure sailors and soldiers could erect in hours, not weeks. At the time, the U.S. military had experimented with something called the Neeson Hut, a British design from World War I. Invented in 1916 by Major Peter Neeson, it was also a curved steel structure, and the British had used them in France. But the American planners decided it wasn't quite right. They wanted something simpler, sturdier, and better suited to mass production in American factories. In other words, a uniquely American version. And this is where Quonset Point, Rhode Island, comes into the story. That's where the Navy commissioned the first prototype of what would soon be called the Quonset Hut. The timing couldn't have been sharper. With the nation mobilizing for total war in 1941, the race was on to build not just weapons and ships, but an entire portable world to house the men who would fight. So by the time American soldiers started shipping out in early 1942, the groundwork for their future homes had already been laid. What looked like a simple curved shell was actually the answer to one of the biggest logistical headaches of World War II. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't flashy, but without it, thousands of men would have been left exposed in the field, vulnerable not just to enemy fire, but to the relentless punishment of weather and terrain. This wasn't just about architecture, it was about survival. And America was about to prove that solving problems like these, fast and at scale, was one of its greatest strengths in the war. When the Navy sent out the call in 1941 for a new type of building, the job landed in the laps of architects and engineers at George A. Fuller Company, working at the Davisville Naval Construction Battalion Center in Rhode Island. The task was straightforward on paper, but monumental in practice. Create a structure that was light, cheap, flat packable, and easy enough for untrained men to assemble with only the most basic tools. It had to be rugged enough to withstand tropical heat, Arctic cold, and everything in between. The design they came up with was brilliantly simple. Picture a half-cylinder made of corrugated steel sheets, arched into a 16 by 36-foot structure. The semicircular shape wasn't just for looks, it gave the hut incredible strength, allowing wind, rain, and snow to slide right off. At each end, plywood panels could be fitted with doors, windows, or vents, depending on the climate and purpose. Inside, the huts could be lined with insulation or left bare. The entire thing was mounted on a simple wooden or concrete foundation, depending on the site. The first prototypes were built at Quonset Point in mid-1941, which is where the huts got their name. They weren't flashy, they weren't luxurious, but they were exactly what the Navy needed. They could be packed into crates small enough to fit on ships and planes, shipped thousands of miles, and then bolted together on the spot. A crew of 6 to 8 men could throw one up in a single day. Compare that to weeks of hammering boards for traditional barracks, and you see why the Quonset Hut was an instant hit. The initial design wasn't perfect, though. The first huts had a 16-foot width, but this proved too cramped for many uses. Soon after, engineers expanded the design to 20 feet and eventually to 40-foot wide versions. Variants quickly popped up for everything from barracks to mess halls, offices, hospitals, and even chapels. The modular design meant you could link huts together, extend them, or modify them on the fly. That flexibility was priceless in war zones where needs changed overnight. By late 1941, the Navy had already placed massive orders. The design was locked in, and factories began stamping out corrugated steel panels by the ton. The Quonset Hut was officially rolling off production lines even as America was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. By the time U.S. troops were landing on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the huts were already there, waiting to shelter them. It's easy to look back now and see the Quonset Hut as inevitable, but it really wasn't. It was born out of a specific moment of urgency, a marriage of industrial might and practical design. Without Quonset Point, without that Navy order, without the quick work of those engineers, the war might have looked very different in the Pacific and beyond. The beauty of the Quonset Hut was its simplicity, steel arches, plywood ends, and a promise. No matter where you sent American troops, they'd have a place to call home, even if it was just for a night. Once the design was finalized in 1941, the United States didn't just build Quonset Huts, they churned them out in numbers that defied belief. America's industrial muscle was already gearing up to produce Liberty ships, Sherman tanks, and B-17 bombers. Adding a hut to the list seemed small in comparison, but it became one of the most prolific wartime products of all. By 1945, more than 100,000 Quonset Huts had rolled out of factories, enough to house entire armies. How did they do it? The secret was the same formula that drove American wartime industry: mass production. Factories across the country were retooled to stamp corrugated steel sheets, cut plywood panels, and package kits that contained every nut, bolt, and instruction needed. Each hut was shipped as a flat-pack kit, weighing about 5 tons. It could be loaded into the hold of a Liberty ship alongside jeeps, rations, and ammunition, then offloaded anywhere in the world. The Fuller Company and other contractors didn't waste time with complicated blueprints. Every hut was standardized, which meant workers could build them like cars on an assembly line. The dimensions were predictable, the parts interchangeable, and the instructions simple. A box of Quonset Hut parts was like a giant Lego set for grown men, except these pieces built the infrastructure of a global war. Numbers tell the story best. In 1942, the Navy ordered over 25,000 huts almost immediately, and production only accelerated from there. Factories in Rhode Island, New Jersey, and later across the Midwest worked around the clock. By 1943, entire ships left American ports carrying nothing but Quonset Hut kits, and the men trained to assemble them. The pace was so relentless that huts were often built faster than the military could decide exactly where they'd go. But the real miracle was how few men it took to raise one. 6 or 8 soldiers with wrenches and hammers could put up a hut in less than a day. No cranes, no skilled carpenters, no engineers on site, just manpower and a box of parts. That speed meant newly captured islands could be transformed into functioning bases almost overnight. Airstrips suddenly had barracks for pilots, kitchens for mess halls, and offices for command posts. A bare patch of jungle could turn into a mini-city in less than a week. It's worth comparing this to the enemy. While German troops were digging into bunkers and Japanese garrisons were burrowing into caves, American forces were building steel towns that rose almost instantly. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant that wherever the U.S. flag landed, a functioning base followed close behind. By the end of the war, production figures rivaled some of the biggest hardware programs of the conflict. Quonset huts weren't just housing, they were a symbol of America's ability to outproduce, outsupply, and outbuild its enemies. It was one thing to send soldiers overseas, it was another thing entirely to give them a ready-made home, waiting in a crate, wherever they landed. Living inside a Quonset hut was unlike anything most American soldiers had ever experienced. For many, it was their first time away from home, and suddenly, their house was a curved shell of corrugated steel planted on foreign soil. These huts were no luxury cabins, but compared to sleeping in a tent that leaked rain and froze at night, they were a godsend. The interiors could be adapted depending on the theater of war. In the South Pacific, the huts were often lined with insulation to dull the relentless heat, and screens were added to keep out clouds of mosquitoes. In colder climates, think Alaska or Northern Europe, stoves were installed, sometimes one at each end, to keep the chill at bay. Wooden floors kept men off the mud, and improvised partitions gave a hint of privacy. Still, most soldiers remembered them as loud, echoing, and often sweltering in the daytime. But here's the thing, Quonset huts weren't just barracks. Their flexibility made them into whatever the military needed at the time. Some became mess halls where hundreds of men lined up for rations. Others were transformed into field hospitals, with rows of cots and the smell of antiseptic in the air. There were huts used as chapels, with crude altars built under the curved roof, where soldiers sang hymns thousands of miles from home. Command posts, storage depots, classrooms, even theaters for makeshift movie nights. If it needed a roof, a Quonset hut could do the job. A soldier arriving on an island like Guadalcanal in 1943 would have seen a sprawl of huts rising almost overnight, turning a raw patch of jungle into a functioning military camp. The huts gave a strange sense of permanence in places that were otherwise alien and hostile. They were symbols of American resourcefulness, proof that no matter where you were shipped, some slice of structure and order followed. Of course, there were downsides. The steel walls magnified the pounding of rain until it was deafening. In the tropics, the inside could feel like an oven. Ventilation was often poor, and humidity could warp the wooden ends. But soldiers adapted, rigging up makeshift fans, cutting extra windows, and doing whatever it took to make the huts livable. After all, compared to foxholes or open-air tents, this was still a step up. Letters home from GIs often mentioned the huts, sometimes with humor, sometimes with complaint, but almost always with gratitude that there was something between them and the elements. In the words of one Marine stationed in the Pacific, "She ain't pretty, but she keeps the rain out. That's all a man can ask for." And perhaps most importantly, the huts offered a strange sense of normalcy. You could hang your gear on a nail, line up your cot, and know that, at least for the night, you weren't at the mercy of the jungle or the desert. For a soldier far from home, that small comfort was worth more than gold. The Quonset hut didn't just stay in American camps, it spread like wildfire across the globe, following the advance of U.S. forces wherever they went. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of New Guinea, these half-moon shelters became part of the landscape of World War II. No matter how remote the location, odds were good that you'd find a cluster of huts forming the backbone of a base. In the Pacific, they were indispensable. When U.S. Marines landed on Tarawa in 1943 or on Iwo Jima in early 1945, establishing a foothold wasn't just about capturing ground, it was about building infrastructure. Quonset huts gave them that instantly. Airfields needed control towers, radio rooms, weather stations, and maintenance shops. Instead of waiting weeks for construction, crates were opened, steel arches were bolted, and within days, a bare island bristled with buildings. Some bases in the Pacific ended up with hundreds of huts arranged like a small town, complete with roads and signs. In Europe, they were just as critical. After D-Day in June 1944, as Allied troops pushed deeper into France, Quonset huts followed close behind. They sprouted in Normandy as makeshift hospitals for the wounded, offices for logistics teams, and barracks for engineers. By the time winter hit the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, Quonset huts were being used as heated shelters, giving troops a break from the freezing Belgian forests. But perhaps the most surprising deployments were in extreme climates. In Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, huts were built to withstand hurricane-force winds and bitter cold. In North Africa, they were planted in dusty camps under a blazing sun, where their curved steel roofs reflected heat away better than canvas tents ever could. In every environment, the same principle applied. A flat-pack building could be shipped and raised faster than any traditional construction. The global footprint was staggering. By 1945, there were Quonset huts on every continent except Antarctica. Soldiers joked that you could tell where the Americans had been by spotting those steel half-circles on the horizon. They became symbols of the U.S. military presence, instantly recognizable even to civilians who had never seen them before. And it wasn't just Americans who used them. Allied nations received Quonset huts through Lend-Lease programs, setting them up in Britain, Australia, and even the Soviet Union. They were universal because they worked, and because no other country had solved the problem of mobile housing at such scale. The huts became so common that many soldiers assumed they'd last forever. They turned barren islands into functioning cities, carved order out of chaos, and gave troops the infrastructure to keep fighting thousands of miles from home. If war is about logistics, then the Quonset hut was one of America's most unsung weapons. By the war's end, it didn't matter if you were on a Pacific atoll, a French farmyard, or an Arctic outpost, you'd see the same curved roofs standing against the sky. They were proof that America hadn't just shipped men overseas, it had shipped an entire civilization with them. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, most people expected the Quonset hut to fade away with the war. After all, these steel arches were meant to be temporary, a quick fix for an urgent crisis. But that's not what happened. Instead, they began a second life, one that would shape post-war America in ways no one could have predicted. First, there was the immediate problem: what to do with all those huts. With more than 100,000 built, the U.S. military suddenly had a surplus on its hands. Many were dismantled and sold as scrap, but thousands more were shipped back home or left standing overseas. The timing was perfect, because America was dealing with its own housing crisis. Millions of GIs were returning from Europe and the Pacific, and the GI Bill was fueling a surge in college enrollments. Cities and universities needed places for these men and their new families to live. and fast. Quonset huts became an instant solution. Across the United States, colleges set up entire hut villages for veterans. At the University of Michigan, for example, returning GIs and their families lived in Quonset hut communities complete with kitchens, bedrooms, and even little yards. Other schools like the University of Minnesota, Brown, and UCLA did the same. These villages weren't glamorous. Many wives joked about cooking in a half-cylinder kitchen, but they were affordable, fast, and better than nothing. Beyond universities, whole towns sprouted Quonset hut neighborhoods. Some were converted into churches, diners, and even dance halls. Small businesses bought surplus huts and turned them into workshops, garages, and warehouses. Farmers loved them too, using the huts as barns and storage sheds. For a generation that had just fought a war defined by scarcity, these ready-made structures felt like gifts. And they didn't just stay in America. Overseas, Quonset huts left behind during the war were absorbed into local communities. In places like the Philippines, Guam, and even parts of Europe, people used them for homes, schools, and shops long after the Americans had moved on. The huts that were meant to vanish after the war became landmarks of survival and recovery. Still, they weren't perfect. Families often complained of poor insulation, leaky roofs, and the constant creak of metal. Winters were brutally cold, summers sweltering hot. But for many, these huts represented stability in a chaotic post-war world. They were a stepping stone, a roof overhead while something more permanent was built. The strangest part? Some huts refused to die. By the 1950s and 60s, thousands were still standing, patched with new siding, windows, or insulation. Even today you can find original Bawe-Wentu Quonset huts, dotting American landscapes, some rusted and abandoned, others still in use as storage or workshops. What started as a wartime necessity ended up reshaping peacetime America. The Quonset hut became more than just a shelter. It was a bridge from the chaos of war to the promise of rebuilding. And like the soldiers who lived in them, these huts proved tougher and more enduring than anyone expected. Even now, nearly 80 years after the end of World War II, the Quonset hut has not vanished. In fact, it has become an enduring symbol of wartime ingenuity, a reminder of how America's industrial might could solve problems on a global scale. You can still drive across parts of the United States and spot them, half-cylinders of corrugated steel standing stubbornly in fields, on college campuses, or behind workshops. Some are battered and rusted, others lovingly restored, but all of them whisper the same story: built fast, built cheap, built to last. The legacy of the Quonset hut is bigger than just nostalgia. Architects and historians often point to it as a precursor to modern prefab housing. The concept of shipping flat-pack kits and assembling them on site is something we now associate with companies like IKEA, but in 1941, America was already doing it on an industrial scale. The hut proved that modular design could be both practical and scalable, and it sparked conversations in the post-war years about solving housing shortages with mass-produced homes. For veterans, the huts carried an emotional weight. Many remember them as the backdrop of their wartime lives, the place where they wrote letters home, laughed with comrades, or collapsed into exhausted sleep after battle. For civilians, the huts became a strange but familiar sight, dotting landscapes from Rhode Island to remote Pacific atolls. They symbolized not just military power, but also the American ability to improvise and adapt. Culturally, the Quonset hut even earned a kind of icon status. Artists painted them, filmmakers used them as backdrops, and writers referenced them as shorthand for the wartime experience. By the 1950s, they had become fixtures in American pop culture, embodying both the grit of war and the hope of rebuilding. In some towns, people still gather in community centers that were once surplus Quonset huts, their curved roofs arching over dances, meetings, and Sunday services. The story doesn't end there. In the 21st century, architects and DIY builders have rediscovered the Quonset form for eco-housing and affordable shelters. The same principles that worked in 1942, simplicity, durability, and cost efficiency, still make sense today. Some companies even manufacture modernized Quonset-style structures for farms, workshops, and homes, proving that the original design never truly went out of style. And maybe that's the most striking legacy of all. These huts were supposed to be temporary, but like the veterans who once lived in them, they endured. They became markers of a generation's struggle and triumph, still standing as silent witnesses to the war that reshaped the world. So next time you see one of those curved steel shells standing quietly on the side of a road, remember, that humble hut helped win a world war, housed soldiers on every continent, and went on to shape post-war life in ways no one could have imagined. In its own quiet way, the Quonset hut is as much a symbol of World War II as the Jeep, the Sherman tank, or the Liberty ship, proof that sometimes the simplest solutions leave the longest shadows.